Welcome, game dev adventurers, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. Today we're talking with Nicholas O'Brien about rethinking the design of social impact indie games.
The Indie Game Lunch Hour.
Welcome all to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. In this live magical podcast, we give game developers the chance to hear stories of breaking in from industry experts, as well as directly ask them questions about their areas of expertise in the second half of each episode. As always, I'm your host, Willem Delventhal, the headmaster here at the Indie Game Academy, and joining me today is Nicholas O'Brien. Nicholas is the founder at SA Games and an adjunct professor at Pratt, here to talk with us about social impact indie games. Nicholas, it is wonderful to have you on the show. What are you having for lunch today?
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real joy to be here. I had a dollar slice. I am based in Brooklyn, and I just got done with teaching, and I knew that I needed to have something before this time. So I picked up a dollar slice just around the corner, and it was delicious.
Amazing. Now, I've heard some real scandal surrounding the dollar slice. Was it indeed $1?
No, no, it wasn't. I was using the common parlance. It was quite more than a dollar, but still still in that you know, you can kind of think about dollar slice being a placeholder basically for what I'm talking about. But yeah, no, it was more than a dollar. And I have seen some of
Mhm.
the controversy. Luckily this dollar slice was like a little bit probably better than the controversial dollar slice. I've had that dollar slice and it is definitely worth $1. Or now I
Mhm.
guess 150 or something. Yeah.
Right. Very interesting. Yeah, it's kind of it's become a piece of language as opposed to an actual description of price, which is kind of funny. But yes, I'm curious what the last date was where a dollar slice that was actually a dollar was available in New York City. Probably a couple of years.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's been a minute. I remember first moving to the city and getting the equivalent of that in bagel form, a deli bagel, and being like, wow, this is so cheap and so great. And then I figured out that I wasn't really having proper New York bagels and realized that that's why I was paying
Really missing
the
out.
yeah, exactly.
Yep. Amazing. Well, thank you and welcome to the show. That's a much more interesting answer than we usually get. People are just like, nah, I'm still drinking coffee. I can't see straight yet. So that's a little lively conversation about dollar slice is a perfect way to start. Before anything else, or after, I guess, our lovely intro there, we love, of course, on the show to highlight origin stories. So, Nicholas, before we get into the topic of the day, I'd love to hear your origin story. So, where are you in games now and how did you get there?
Yeah, totally. So, as you said in the intro, I'm the founder of SA Games, which is a small solo studio based in Brooklyn. We make kind of thought-provoking, nuanced, narrative-focused or narrative-leaning video games that usually have some kind of socially conscious message behind them.
Mhm.
And I have an unconventional, I think, origin story. My origin story starts in art school, where I went as a painter and became a filmmaker while I was there. And when I graduated film school, I lost access to everything, as
No.
happens when you graduate from school. And
Mhm.
so the darkroom that I was using, the film equipment that I was using, and a lot of the kind of accoutrements that come with being in school were no longer available to me. So I kind of took this long ish winding path to games by going through animation and teaching myself Blender. And during that process, somewhere along the way, I was like, I want these animations and the 3D renders that I'm making to be more interactive and more kind of not so much a proscenium setting, but to be something where somebody's affecting what they're seeing on the screen. So I taught myself Unity a while ago. I think it was Unity 5 that I actually taught myself,
Mhm.
and slowly started, making small interactive works and interactive pieces that were much more for a gallery setting than they were for like a commercial game market setting.
Mhm.
And then over time, I realized what I wanted to do is that I wanted to make kind of more, kind of legitimate, I would say, games. And so I made a couple what you would call art games, not just kind of myself as Nicholas O'Brien. And then I made a game in 2019, kind of 2020 or 2020, that was called The Last Survey. And when I was kind of nearing the end of that game, I was approached by a publisher called Red Deer Games to port that game to a Switch. That I didn't think that that was something that was going to be available to me. And what that did is that it opened up this whole new audience for me, and it showed an audience that was very prepared for um, kind of in-depth reading and in-depth kind of critical thinking, and something that I was not seeing as much in a gallery context. And I, yeah, kind of made this pivotal decision to be like, you know what, I want to do games full time. I want to run a studio. I want to shift my practice to be kind of thinking about games first and art kind of, or being an artist somewhat secondary. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I arrived at then founding the studio in 2021 and then working on projects from then.
That's so cool. So then that publisher, did you have an actual publishing agreement with that person?
Yes. So Red Deer Games, their kind of business model up to that point, they've
Hmm.
since shifted and they do more original IPs and also
Hmm.
um, game kind of game partnerships with existing IPs. But their kind of model at that point was taking games that had some kind of either publishing success or critical success, and then thinking about how to potentially port them to other platforms. So yeah, so a scout approached me from the company, and they asked me if I was interested in porting the game, and they at first wanted to port it to Xbox and PlayStation as well. And I said, I don't really think the game that I had made, The Last Survey, is an experimental, hand drawn visual novel. And I said, I don't really think that that's going to go over super well with the demographics that are on those consoles. So let's try Switch first. And so then when we did that, it got picked up really, really right away from that demographic. And yeah, like I said, I kind of gained access almost overnight to this brand new audience that was emailing me and sending me messages and wanting to like talk to me about the game and going to the Steam page and leaving comments on the Steam page. And so yeah, that like was really exciting and encouraging. And yeah.
Hmm. That's tremendously exciting. I think it is for a lot of people, it's a dream that they wind up getting approached by a scout. The first question I think that a lot of people will have from this conversation, because what you have achieved so far, Nicholas, is what a lot of people dream of, especially in this community. I would say virtually everybody in this space is actively trying to start a studio, or at least dreams of running their own studio at some point. So do you have any tips for us? Like, how did that scout wind up finding you? Do you know how that deal transpired? What did you put out there? Maybe like how did it wind up actually happening?
That's a really good question. I think I have two answers to it. I think the first answer that I have is that I had gotten a little bit of press um, around the initial release of that game. Um,
Hmm.
and so it possibly could have been through that. And again, it was a little bit more like art world press than it was game, I would say, like Games Central press.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that it could have possibly happened through that. And I think it also could have definitely happened through a Kickstarter campaign that I did, which wasn't actually funding the game itself, but was
Hmm.
funding a kind of transmedia version of the game, which was performing the game in front of a live audience with live musical accompaniment. And the
Hmm.
game is a visual novel and it has these branching narrative paths. And so I then created this little applet with a collaborator for people to collectively vote on what paths to choose. And then the live accompaniment would change depending on the choices that they made, and we would kind of go explore those choices together. Um, so yeah, so the Kickstarter was to fund that and basically to pay
Hmm.
the musicians and the accompaniment, and then to also make this little applet as a kind of accompaniment with the game. So I think it's also possible that they were kind of like troving successful Kickstarter projects, and they
Hmm.
found the game through that, and they were like, "This thing is doing something really strange and interesting and different," and I want to check this out. And it was about like maybe 4 or 5 conversations with them, back and forth, kind of working out the contract, working out the deals. They were very, very transparent, very open,
Mhm.
I had a lot of notes on the contract, and I contacted a lawyer. I contacted a lawyer, and then I contacted another lawyer that was like more about IP. They said, things seemed really good. Might want to add these clauses. And so yeah, it was a back and forth, but they were very, very amenable and very transparent. And yeah, and kind of funnily enough, I think that contract is about to be renewed, which reminds me that I need to probably send them an email to do that. But yeah, yeah. So yeah, it was just like a series of conversations. But I think that that's how they probably initially found the project.
hmm That's tremendously exciting. I think we've heard one of the things I love about doing this show is, we get advice that's completely out there, unique to the individual, but we also get advice that we hear time and time again. And one of those ones that we hear time and time again is basically put yourself out there. It's difficult to. As somebody who has run something on the side my entire professional career, it is difficult to make space for really trying at your passions while you keep yourself financially afloat. But I think your story is an example of how that can really pan out for you and in a way that you didn't expect. You weren't really looking for a publisher. You were looking to create this interesting transmedia experience. You were literally trying to fund something largely separate from what wound up actually happening for you. And yet, this opportunity presented itself. You took advantage of it. You made sure it was safe for yourself. I think contract negotiations are good to spend some time going back and forth on. And then once you had that opportunity and you were taking advantage of the opportunity, you really leaned all the way into it. You were like, okay, yeah, I can make a company that's all about telling interesting stories through games. I think all of that is something that the audience can take away from this story.
100%. The other thing that I would just like highlight there too, that I didn't really know at the time, but I got some good advice on that I just want to
hmm
share with your audience too, is like contracts are a negotiation. They're never like one and done, right? If the person that you're wanting to create a contract with doesn't want to negotiate, then you do not want to have a contract with them, right?
hmm
I think going into that first kind of initial foray into that collaboration, I was a little scared about sending them back notes, right? I was like kind of worried that I was going to be like, "Hey, I need you to change things on this thing," and they were going to say, "No, never mind, we're not interested." But that's like absolutely not the case. And if they're a professional outfit and they have done this a million times, or they've done it enough times to know that that's part of the process, and yeah, I just would encourage anybody that's going into that to really make sure that you know that that's just part of the process. It's ingrained, it's baked into the bread there.
100%. And something else I'd say there too is oftentimes the contract negotiation can like feel harsher than the institution organization actually is. Lawyers are going to, and anybody who's got any kind of legalese is going to be very careful about the language and the promises that are made. And so, they'll say no. They'll say, well, this is all we can do. And they might be a little bit more. It might feel at least a little harsher, but oftentimes I like to recommend that you kind of think of like the legal side versus the actual humans, the people side of an organization as separate. My current day job is like a ton of fun, but it took us 3 months to negotiate the contract. And it was such a
Right,
pain in the ass.
right.
But at this point in time, I trust them, love them. They're great, So sometimes people are just negotiating. All right, but that's
Yeah.
enough about that. Let's jump into the topic of the day, which is one that's near and dear to my heart. You already spoke to my soul, Nicholas, by including indie in your episode title. We are the Indie Game Academy, after all. I am all for people who are self-funding, who are figuring out how to support themselves financially in games. So, topic of the day: rethinking the design of social impact indie games. Can you give us your 101 introduction to that topic?
100%. So I think initially, before I get to the 100%, there's like a little bit of a preamble here, which is that when I'm thinking about rethinking the design, I think that going into making socially conscious or socially impactful games, I leaned heavily on the way in which social impact games rely on narrative. And that should make sense, right? Like when you're wanting to tell a compelling story, or when you're wanting to convey critical information, or when you're wanting to be thought provoking in various different ways, words are really good at doing that, right? Narrative and story and character design and all that stuff is very, very good at conveying very specific intentions and meaning. But I don't think it's the only tool that developers and designers have at their disposal. And I think that occasionally, people that are making socially conscious or socially impactful games tend to think that the only way in which they can deliver their message is through that narrative, is through words. So the kind of the 101 is really thinking about what are the emotional touchstones that you're hoping to elicit from your player, right? If you're hoping to elicit sympathy or empathy, or if you're wanting to elicit worry or stress, or if you're wanting to elicit, knowledge and information, right? What other tools do you have at your disposal to be able to elicit those emotions that aren't just text, right? Sometimes like complex emotions are easier, right? Like to get at or get to the heart of when you're using words, right? You can say, now you should be feeling a certain way, or this is something that's happening that's going to elicit a certain type of emotion. But gameplay can do that too, right? There's countless examples in non-indie games of having emotional responses to characters doing things, to making pivotal choices, to playing different things that are going to land emotionally in different ways, right? You can think about having sorrow or having regret or having joy or jubilation or stress or anxiety, or all of these different kind of range of emotions that can happen just by playing the thing, right? Not necessarily by reading what the game is wanting to kind of tell you, but by actually playing it. So one of the things that I would oftentimes cite, or one of the things that I would oftentimes kind of push designers to think about, is to think about how they can translate some of the emotional content of their narrative into gameplay, right? So
Mhm.
an example of that might be like, okay, if you're wanting to elicit something that's stressful, how can you create a mechanic that induces stress as opposed to telling the player this might be a stressful thing that's happening, right? If
Mhm.
you're wanting to induce sympathy, right, you might create a mechanic, or you might create a sequence of events where you think you know something that's going on, and then that thing changes in a certain way, or there's something that disrupts that and has unintended consequences based upon the actions that you performed, right? Uh, so there's different ways, there's different mechanical ways in which you can think about translating the narrative content of your social message into gameplay itself.
Mhm. Yeah, this is I love this topic. This is one that I get into a lot myself. So I am largely a game designer, gameplay designer. So I do mechanics and systems. How does the game play? How does it function? And one of the things that we talk about really early on is our emotional pillars. What are the ways that we want our player to feel? And what are they meant to feel over time as well? So there's sort of these are sort of two separate categories of things. There's the emotional pillars for the entire game. So how should the game itself make you feel? How should you leave feeling? And then there's emotional objectives for each beat. So what's going to happen
Mm.
at this point of the game? What's going to happen at that point of the game? And I agree. Like you can have a hands down beautiful narrative with wonderful writing, awesome voiceover, and make a player feel a certain way. But then if the world and how I engage with the world feels subtracted or distanced from that, or just like it doesn't really care about that, you can lose a lot of the impact. I use a lot of old school examples because I guess I'm getting old now. I don't know. So one of the
We can
examples I'll
commiserate
bring up
together.
here.
Yeah.
Yes, it's weird. It's weird feeling like, oh, I actually am getting old now. Is Mega Man X. Mega Man X is a phenomenal example of game design in so many different ways. And one of the things that I think they do so well is they set you up for a feeling of powerlessness as well as a feeling of progression, a feeling of upgrade. And they do that all in the very beginning of the game when you have the boss fight with what's his face. You see, oh shoot, I'm forgetting his name. Who's the red Mega Man?
Zero.
Zero? Zero. You see Zero absolutely kick ass. He has all the upgrades that you'll eventually get, and this boss humbles you, kicks your butt, and then Zero shows up and just wrecks him. And it's a great way of, first of all, tutorializing the player. You're fighting this really hard boss. It's got that Dark Souls vibes or something like that. And then Zero shows up, saves the day, gives you a direct visual example of how powerful you'll get, and suddenly the progressive power scaling feel of this game is there instantly with very little text actually said. That's true. You never get his sword, Rick, which is highway robbery. But yes, that's I think a great example of how a game's mechanics can make you feel a particular way. Now, I I think you're sort of alluding to something just slightly shy of what I'm talking about, which I'm talking about the internal team's desires for how the game should feel to the player, but you're talking about social impact feels.
Right.
How the messages and lessons you want your player to learn actually get translated into gameplay as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, 100%. So And you're totally right. That's a great example, right? Like, how do you show the player what they will become, right? How do you show
Hmm.
the player that they could potentially change over the course or develop into being, for Mega Man X, right? This ultimate badass or something. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
but I think for social impact games, the thing that you want to be delivering is thinking about. I guess the way that I would answer that is a different way of thinking about what you highlighted in that game and to think about pacing, right? Pacing is such an important element of any type of visual storytelling. If you are overwhelming the player with information or data or mechanics or strife or content or whatever it is, right? Challenge, the player is going to bounce off of that experience, right? So through pacing and through developing kind of consistent beats, like you called them, there's a really good way, a really good formula of kind of giving your player into flow states and so on and so forth. But in terms of social impact games, one of the key elements of kind of articulating that type of pacing is really thinking about where the player is starting from and where they're arriving at, right?
Mm.
So it's not necessarily so much about like for you as a developer, what are the emotional pillars, right? It's
Mhm.
more about where do you want the player arriving at by the conclusion of either a segment or the entire gameplay, right? Do you
And
want
when
to
you say
arrive
arriving at, you're talking about the player themselves, things changing, happening inside of themselves. Is that correct?
100%. 100%.
Hmm.
Yes. Yeah, not necessarily the playable character, right? But the individual
Hmm.
behind the controller, right? So if you are creating mechanics in which that process is not, you're not integrating the process of that journey into gameplay, then I think you're missing a huge opportunity, right? And that's what I mean about like rethinking, right? If you are given a player an opportunity to grow, quote unquote, mature, not like radically mature, but to expand their consciousness, expand their idea of something, expand their knowledge, expand their familiarity with something, or to gain empathy, or to gain sympathy, or gain um, um, maybe a little bit of expertise or understanding or know-how in the experience, then you're kind of hitting the right mark, right? But you have to understand, I think you have to do two things. You have to understand where the player is starting from and how you're setting them up in that starting position, and then where they're arriving, right? What is the thing that then you want them to arrive to by the end of that um, experience, right?
Hmm. I love that. I am just myself in my own career learning about basically design leadership, like holding a design team together and creating a cohesive story that way, which
Mm.
is a whole set of skills into and of itself. So I'm always a big fan of any frameworks that we can kind of agree to, because once we've agreed to the framework, it's a lot easier for us to all work together on something. That's the purpose of emotional pillars in general. If we can all agree how the game should feel, we're going to have a much more cohesive game in the end. So I like this starting from arriving at. Are you able to throw us some examples maybe? What is even if they're just made up on the fly, like what is a starting from and an arriving at for some social impact indie games?
Well, I'll give two examples. I'll give one example
Hmm.
that's of my own game that I just published called Bundle of Joy. And Bundle of Joy
Hmm.
is a dad simulator minigame romp. And it is lighthearted and playful, but dealing with some pretty heavy content, which is becoming
Hmm.
apparent during the pandemic. And for anyone that has become a parent or for anyone that has experience doing any kind of childcare, you know that it's a pretty stressful thing. So when you are kind of initially starting that game launches you into a very stressful environment right away. So it kind of sets the tone of being like, this is an intense experience, right? This is, not
Hmm.
for the faint of heart. Parenting is hard. And so through the first kind of core mini games that you play, the difficulty curve is not super steep, but it definitely is fast, right? So it hits you kind of at the speed of what child rearing might be. Life comes at you fast, right? But then after that, and this is where pacing I think is really important. After that, there's a moment of downtime where the baby kind of is napping, right, or you kind of have a break. And in that moment is when the kind of story starts to kind of deliver some of its content. The main protagonist reflects on becoming a dad, what that means, what all of the emotional stakes that are at play there. But I think the player is really open to having that moment at that point because they've just been bombarded with a lot of activities. So they need a
Mm.
break, right? They need a moment to kind of collect themselves. They need a moment to uh, actively participate in some downtime. And as a result, they're kind of a little bit raw, right? They're kind of like, oh my goodness, I don't know what was just going on. I'm a little bit in the dark here. Maybe I'm a little bit confused. But through this narrative and through the storytelling, I'm kind of filling in some of the blanks about the other things that I should be feeling besides just stress, right?
Hmm.
So you're kind of doing, without giving myself too much credit, you're doing a little bit of a bait and switch, right? You're making the player experience a gameplay segment that's eliciting a certain type of emotional feel, and then you're giving them a moment to digest that emotional moment, reflect on that emotional moment, and then guide that emotional moment through, other types of gameplay and content. So that's
Hmm.
one example.
Hmm.
Um, another example that I would say is I would look at a lot of Pixel Hunt, the Pixel Hunt, their studio games that they make, I think do a really, really good job of establishing a certain type of expectation and then either subverting or undoing or playing with or um, how could you say reconfiguring what your expectations are in that experience. A game that people will probably be familiar with that they made is called Bury Me My Love. It's a mobile game um, that is about told from a refugee kind of experience. Um, uh, and yeah, and so it's reflecting on that experience and trying to give you a sense of um, what the emotional state of someone undergoing displacement, being in a camp, being in an uncomfortable situation, being displaced, being not of their home, not being able to go back home, not knowing where their
Hmm.
family is, all of these very intense emotional experiences. But they do it all through the interface of a chat, right? So the
Hmm.
entire experience isn't that that you're kind of being told what this experience is like, but you're making these kind of emotional choices through a text with individuals that are either that you're trying to reconnect with, either or trying to help you in the process, or that you are trying to seek asylum in certain ways. And so through that chat and through the mechanism and the device of the phone, that really does this amazing framing for the experience. And then there's other moments that you kind of have moments to reflect on those experiences that act as kind of transitional points. Um, so I think that that's also a really good example of thinking about where you're starting the player from and where you're hoping to arrive at, right? And thinking about how the mechanic or the device or the way in which you're kind of conveying that emotional state can dictate a lot of that pacing or dictate the way in which you're going through that process.
Hmm. That's really fascinating. I think I didn't actually know about the Pixel Hunt before this. Bury Me My Love looks like a really fascinating story. If we can like break it down to hyper simple bullet point form, what would you call starting from and then arriving at, a sentence or less each for Bury Me My Love?
Ooh, that's tough. I think starting at um, you start at uncertainty and you
Hmm.
start at conflict, I would say. You start knowing that where you are is not where you want to be. Um,
Hmm.
Bury My Love is also about a journey. So the thing that you arrive at is um, not necessarily resolution, but an understanding that the journey doesn't end necessarily once you've secured asylum,
Mm.
right? That the journey just kind of continues, right? And that that's not bullet points, but that the journey is ongoing, right? That
Yeah.
even if you accomplish the thing that you set out to do, you're just getting started, right? And the kind of
Yeah.
overwhelming feeling that can land in that moment.
I love that. Yeah, I feel like if we were going to get, I love snappy titles that people will remember because then they get used more often on teams. I find so I feel like the starting from then that you described is where you are is not where you're meant to be. I think that's
Mm,
a really potent feeling. We can all feel that in different aspects of our lives at different times in our lives. And then I love arriving at the journey is ongoing. Um,
mm,
Both really powerful messages, and I can definitely see the arc of creating an experience that brings the player from one to the other. Really beautiful. My last question before we jump into some comment questions, some audience questions, is could you give us a couple of mechanics, just like your tried and true staples? It could be as simple as multi-choice dialogue. What are some of the ways that you incorporate some social impact, some mechanics that you can tie the narrative into on a daily basis for people to use?
Yeah, I think that branching dialogue is always going to be a helpful tool that a
Hmm.
helpful mechanic and tool that developers and designers can use. I really like trying to use branching dialogue as ways of presenting different perspectives about the same thing. So instead of it being like just flavor or maybe even mechanical choices, um,
Hmm.
I think of it being more like you might have one perspective on what the sequence of events are that are unfolding in front of you, but what would it look like if you looked at from it from a slightly different perspective, right? Or what if you, in this moment, did a bit of reflection and considered the devil's advocate, right, argument on the other side? What does that do to then the framing of the content that you're exploring and how you can kind of sift through that content? So for sure, that's like definitely one mechanic that people can use.
Hmm.
I'm a big proponent of environmental storytelling. I think environmental
Hmm.
storytelling gets I wouldn't say underutilized, but I think when it's utilized extremely well, can carry so much emotional heft for your game. And I'm not talking about necessarily like Fallout style third person shooter games where you stumble upon a skeleton and it has a book and the book is a diary and the diary talks about his family. That I mean that's whatever good environmental storytelling, but it can be much more small than that, right? It can be like um, you know, an object or a prop that's in a game that has personal meaning to the player, right? What does that thing do? What does that thing, um, what does that object convey? Even if it's not something lofty or hefty or really significant, you can be really intentional with what that object can serve. Again, I would say like an example of that is like in Bundle of Joy, the spoon that you're using is like, a baby spoon. It's not just like a default spoon, but it's like has this very kind of it's pulling from this very specific brand of a silicone style spoon that is,
Hmm.
talking about teething and all this stuff. So how do you do little bits and pieces of that stuff that's really framing the content, right? Um, so I think that that's also something that's really underutilized in games. Um, yeah, maybe I'll end there because I want to leave time for questions and to hear from our lovely guests.
That's great. Yeah, there's a lot of really good ones just in environmental storytelling alone. I at some point somebody said to me, Elden Ring, and for that matter, all Souls likes tell their stories through vibe, which I thought was hilarious and very true. There's if you want to in a Souls like, you can absolutely learn exactly what happened along different points in their lore. But a lot of what happened is just like, I entered a world where there's a bunch of giants on spears. That's weird. And they never actually tell you what happened unless you go looking for it. And as you said, like that's a pretty specific example of environmental storytelling. That's like, I put the evidence in front of the player of what happened here. But it doesn't even need to be that much. Just changing the text on your main menu start game button can change the entire feeling of your game.
Totally. I was going to say this thing, in environmental storytelling, certainly staging is an important part of that, but also
Hmm.
exposition I think is really important and something that is also underutilized in games. And by
Hmm.
exposition, I really lean on film as a good example of this. If you think of like the old corny westerns, there's always kind of a scene in one of those films where the cowpokes get on their horse and they ride through these majestic landscapes, and there's a moment of Americana and whatever a banjo twangs and so on and so forth. And you have this moment where the characters are reflecting on the journey that's happening, and in that exposition, there's storytelling that's happening, right?
Hmm.
There's emotional content that's happening. There's anticipation. There's anxiety. There's relief. There's rest. There's pause. There's the sublime. There's all these things that's happening in in a montage that's maybe 30 seconds long within a game or within a film. And something that a game that I think that does this really well, that's really not talked about or is talked about as a negative thing, is A Thousand Times Resist. I think about how
Hmm.
moving around the hub world in that game is actually really important to the affective experience of that game. And
Hmm.
I don't think of A Thousand Times Resist as being a socially impact game, but it's definitely a game that has a message, right? It's definitely a game that has critical thoughts in it and critical reflections about family and trauma and um, yeah, being and identity, right? Um, but also one of the themes is like alienation, right? Feeling not of yourself. And when you're in the hub world and you're running around and you're feeling lost and you're in this big cavernous space that's windy and kind of hard to pathfind through, that has an affective toll, an affective toll on the player. So I think that where people are like, oh, I didn't like the walking sequences, is that I just like think of those old westerns. It's like that's what you're doing there. You're like having moments of thinking about how even as a player you don't feel like you necessarily belong in this space.
Mm. That's awesome. I saw A Thousand Times Resist for the first time at the IGF Awards. I guess just this last year, actually, and I still have yet to
Mm.
play it. But man, it looks so cool. All right, well, wonderful. So I think, if I'm not mistaken,
Question of the day.
wow, it's time for the question of the day. So we're going to change this one up a little bit. I'm actually going to ask those in the audience to participate in a small creative exercise. For those who are listening after the fact, participate on your own as well. Would you like to tell us, Nicholas, while we transition to questions from the audience, what our question of the day is?
Yeah, so our question slash challenge of the day is thinking about a pitch for a game idea, or thinking of a game that does this, where the social message of the game is paired with a particular mechanic, right? So we talked through some examples that we talked about, but yeah, what kind of ideas do you have or examples that you might have where the
Mhm.
mechanic, the design, the gameplay design matches the content, I guess, the
Mhm.
message.
So give us in the chat an idea for a game and a mechanic that you can pair with it to create some sort of positive social impact. Nicholas is going to pick his favorite from amongst those who type in the chat, and you will get 3 House Cup points for the person who has picked his favorite. In the meantime, we're going to give you 1 question's worth of time to do this. Hamna, would you like to ask your question of Nicholas?
Hi.
Hey,
Hi.
Hamna.
Nice to have you here. Nick, I have a question. So you did a narrative game, and then you made another narrative game, and despite how well it was perceived or it did on the market, the general sentiment with narrative games is they're tough to market.
Mm.
Why did you do this? What in you bespoke you to be like, okay, despite the general sentiment, right? I'm gonna go ahead and I'll make this. Was it just that your first game did well, or was there another reason behind it?
Stubbornness. Um, without being glib, thanks, Hamna, for that question. That's a really great question. I think you're right. I think that narrative games typically are harder to market. They're more quote unquote demanding on players as a piece of content. They often are not just demanding in terms of gameplay, but also demanding in terms of thinking, right? They ask the player questions, and sometimes players don't want to be asked questions. They just want to be, how could you say, like, uh, they just want to zone out, right? Or like, go into a fantasy or what have you. So I think, like, to answer the question more specifically, I think that comes from like my art background, right? I think that a lot of that is I've always said about my projects that I think of my work as being a comma in a sentence rather than a period. And I think that I really want work to be conversational. I don't want it to be definitive. I don't want it to say this is how this thing is. This is how a way of thinking and being and existing is, right? But rather, here's a perspective. And what is that perspective? How can that perspective perhaps make you think about your own perspective, right? I think narrative does a really good job of asking questions, right? Not demanding questions, but just being curious and inquisitive and exploratory and introspective, right? I think that really powerful media and really powerful art um, asks us to think about our own situation and think about our own ways in which we're experiencing the world, and how maybe we can shift that experience or shift that perspective or widen the aperture on that perspective to include more things. So I think that that's tentatively why. I think thinking about the market stuff. I don't know. I'm still learning. right? I think I'm still trying to figure that slice out. I'm still trying to think about, is there a way? And I think with my most recent game, it's mini games kind of first and foremost, and then narrative is definitely important and a central pillar to the design. And um, but I really wanted to try to think about how to be sneaky with that narrative stuff, right? By luring people in with a false sense of security that they were playing a mini game WarioWare style type experience.
To me, that
Amazing. Does that
sounds like
answer your question?
it does answer my question. And I can get off stage after this, but to me, that sounds like you're playing on your strengths, which is a good thing. So I applaud you for that. Thanks for answering the question.
Thank you, Hamna.
Thank you
Absolutely.
so
Yeah.
much.
I would call out the same thing about your answer there. I think it is a really interesting mix. Because of the Indie Game Academy, I'm constantly trying to figure out, what works. What is the secret formula that causes an indie success story? And I think we're all trying to figure that out. There have been teams that I've spoken with and people that I've learned from that they have a really rigorous process. They really hone in on very specific target markets. They really do their research. They check. They build a game that is for an exact type of person that they know they can reach. They're really methodical, and that works for some people. And then there's other people, and I think this tends to be the predominant indie mindset, who just make something because it feels right in their soul, and that winds up getting picked up and loved as well. I don't think either is necessarily right. I do think indies and juniors tend to spend too little time being on that practical businessy side, and I think you could all use a little bit of that. You can still make something you love and that you feel artistically connected to, and also make it realistically possible for it to make money. But yeah, I love that you are, showing us the multiple ways to make something, air quotes here, successful.
Mm, mm. And I think that, talking about the journey, right? Talking about where you start and where you arrive from, that happens also as a developer, right? So,
Hmm.
thinking about where you're arriving on from, I think it's really important when you're designing things to uh, think about what you are going to gauge success as at the end of the journey, right? Is success financial? Is success critical? Is success personal? Is success something else? Really setting those boundaries for yourself initially, I think will make the overall process much more rewarding.
Hmm. Beautiful. All right, so we have some answers to the questions of the day. If you look in the chat, Nicholas, you can read them in their entirety. But I'm going to give you kind of a summary of each one so you can pick your fave. So Naj wants to create a game that uses branching dialogue to teach you basically how to formulate good and healthy arguments. So uh, how to be argumentative without being destructive, perhaps. Wendy wants to make a game about exploration and fighting where you owe some money, and you use memory fragments to realize who you are and that you've lost somebody important to you. Rick wants to make a game where you've got three factions: religious, capitalist, and progressive. And at the end of the game, you discover that leadership is hypocritical, and that none of those factions are really correct. And then Willow wants to make a game about sign language and the use of sign language, that the where the player is a sign language interpreter and they're teaching sign language through their game. What do you think?
Oh, uh, I mean, those are all really cool ideas. I
Hmm.
really like the idea of like making a branching dialogue game that's about framing arguments. Naja's recommendation or idea is really cool. This sign language game from Willow, I could see that paired with a very cool motion control or dual sense type of some hardware incorporation into that,
Hmm.
some alt control incorporation into that. I think that there's a lot of kind of design sensibilities around uh, both informing but also creating perspective around using ASL or sign language in general. I'd really think about who the characters are in that type of game. Um, I think that that's also something that's really important in terms of thinking about what you're establishing, right? What perspective are you presenting your social impact game from, right? Is it someone that's already deeply ensconced in the social message, right? Or is it someone that's perhaps looking from the outside in and wanting to discover more? So I'm gonna pick that one, the sign language game, because I think that there's just like a lot of uh, a lot of potential for thinking about what that game mechanically could do, both from a controller perspective and a hardware perspective, and then also from a character design.
Very cool. Nice. Well done to Willow. So, Willow, you've won yourself 3 House Cup points. Let us know in the chat which house you would like to give those points to. Warrior, Ranger, Cleric, or Rogue. Warriors are currently dominating. Rogues are currently tagging a little bit behind. We've got Major Bacon up on stage for the second community question. Major Bacon, would you like to ask your question of Nicholas?
Sure thing. Hi, Nicholas. Thanks a lot for doing this. This is very like awesome, like knowledge that you're spitting at us, and it's really cool to see this. And I guess like when we were initially talking about how a cultural impact can be made to make a social message, my initial issue that was tackling that I end up facing when I'm trying to think about games like that is how to make the gameplay effect with it. Games like Who's Lila and even Spiritfarer, as of recently, like really
Mm.
amazing games that end up giving such a message. And then there are games that translate outside of their own medium and end up being something other than not just video games, and that's where args come into play. And my question is, what are your thoughts on that? Because that entirety is also a game designed with a message being told. I'm curious on your thoughts on the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that there's like maybe a couple things there, Major. And thanks so much for your question and your kind words. That's really sweet to hear. I think from an ARG perspective, it's really funny. I'm teaching a course right now where one of the student groups, is making an ARG as part of their final project, and it's been really fun thinking about them iterating and designing through the types of experiences that they want the player to have. Um, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity for ARGs to have socially driven um, content, and to think about social messaging. I think in that way, when I think about social impact games, or your question made me think about how social impact games oftentimes get into these pitfalls, and I think I saw this in the chat earlier too. They get into these pitfalls, I think, a lot of the time, where they really try to drive home a point in a way that can sometimes even be off-putting for the audience. And I think as a designer, your role is to think about how you can be really sneaky with delivering that content, right? So a game like Spiritfarer, for instance, where that game is about uh, has a mechanical core that's kind of very far and aside from its core content of thinking about trauma and death and loss and forgiveness and self fulfillment and so on and so forth. Um, you don't really get to that stuff until you're kind of 10 hours into the game, right? Or maybe not that long, but you don't really get to that stuff, the meat of that stuff, until quite far into it. So in terms of ARGs, and I think even indies thinking about how to deliver these kind of more socially minded messages, is think about how you can kind of get the player to be vulnerable enough to receive that information, right? And some of that stuff we were talking about before in terms of where they're starting and where they're going. But what opportunities do you have for the player to be a little bit more open, right? You don't ever want a player to kind of come to your experience like already with their arms crossed, right? You don't want them to be like, oh yeah, prove to me that you're going to make me feel a certain way or do a certain thing, right? I think that you're always kind of working on your back foot when that's the case. But if you kind of open up the experience with a little bit more generosity and perhaps mystery or uncertainty or unknowing of what you're going to get yourself into, then you kind of leave a door open for the player to step through, right? Um, yeah, you don't want to. I always kind of talk about this too with my students. Like, you never want to lecture; you always want to converse, right? If you're lecturing at a player about what they're playing or the content or the message or the meaning of what they're trying to create, you're gonna basically scare them away, right? You're gonna spook them, and you're gonna have somebody that's gonna not really be super receptive to that information.
That's your question, Bacon?
Yeah, I kind of understand it. Yeah, it answered my question pretty well. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that is it's actually the third question from the audience is the same question more or less. When something is too on the nose, players feel preached to, and how do you avoid that? And I think that one's from Rick, as always. I think I would largely agree with you there. I think like humans can't be told they have to be led, and even that sounds far too reductive. I think from what I'm trying to say. Um, People need to make up their own minds and they need to come to the conclusion on their own. And so if you're saying, "Hey, here's the conclusion. That's what you should do. That's what you should be," then they have a natural disposition to actually resist that change because they are, they want to come to it on their own. And that's why I think a lot of the best positive impact games, when a fresh designer comes up with a positive impact game, they make a game where you walk around and pick up bottles and put them in the recycling. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what is the inherent reason for a player to do that? Why would they want to do that? And if they didn't already believe in recycling, would they actually play that game? The answer is basically no. So I think the best positive impact games, the best social impact games, are the games that aren't about recycling and happen to work in a message about recycling that makes you go, yeah, I should really recycle more. Like, and that's the end of the game, or at least some part of the game.
Yeah, totally. I think that that's kind of like a very tried and true design um, thought exercise, right? When you're
Mhm.
like designing, when you're doing product design, even, right? You're not like selling the shoe, right? You're like selling the lifestyle, right? Selling like where the shoe would fit in the world, right? So
Mhm.
that when you are arriving at the point of then saying like you want this shoe, they're like, well, really, I want that world, right? Or I want that, lifestyle or whatever, right? But it's a similar thing with like social impact stuff, and not to be too much about like to think of it from a marketing perspective, but it
Mhm.
is like can be very powerful, right? If you are going to lecture at somebody about uh, you know changing their view or perspective about something, that's going to be a lot less effective and a lot less meaningful than showing a perspective, or showing a scenario in which the player can inject themselves or project themselves into that perspective and walk around and explore and consider and mull and be introspective about the things that they're experiencing. I think
Mhm.
we were talking about mechanics a little bit before, and I think that's something that social impact games sometimes, and I think narrative games in general, tend to avoid is ambiguity. And I think that sometimes ambiguity can be a huge asset to a game designer or to a narrative creator, to not say this is the way and this is not the way, or this is right or this is wrong, or this is what I want you to feel and this is what I don't want you to feel, but
Mhm.
instead to leave some room open for the player to then arrive at the decision that they want to, right? Um, and even if they don't side on, whatever social message maybe that you're wanting to get across, at least they've gone through the process of contemplating it, right? At least
Mhm.
you've planted a seed in their thought process to think about when the next time it comes around. Well, maybe I had this experience with this content, and now I'm thinking about it a little bit differently. Yeah, I think that that's a great design opportunity to weasel into someone's weasel into someone's thinking.
That's beautiful. Yeah, the allowing them to experience being the avatar. Like if you say to somebody like, "Wow, it's really bad being a refugee," they will intellectually be like, "Yeah, that sounds right." If instead you simply give them the experience of being a refugee, don't say a word about how bad or good it is, they'll probably leave that experience going, "Man, it really sucks to be a refugee in a war-torn country," or whatever your positive impact is.
Mm.
All right, we are very much at the end of the episode. This has been a fun chat. Before we say goodbye, we've got two things to do. First thing is to assign some homework. So, Nicholas, what is something the audience can do in the next week that'll take them about an hour to practice some of what we talked about here today?
Yes. I think one thing that everyone should do is to think about what that social message is, right? Even if you're not
Hmm.
making a social impact game, think about what you want to be telling players, right? Do you want to be telling players violence is a solution, right? Do you want to be
Hmm.
telling players uh, greed is good? Do you want to be telling players um, forget your friends, go it alone, right? Or do you want to be telling players, uh, something contrary to those motivations that sometimes are so central within a gameplay experience?
Hmm.
There's opportunity to deliver social messages in your game that are not heavy-handed, that aren't, you know, you know, driving home a point that you need to have. But there are ways in which you can design your story and your experience and your gameplay that are encouraging certain types of, social behaviors, right? And what are those social behaviors that you want to encourage within your designs? So your homework is to think about what that is. What is the core? What is that belief? What is that pillar that you want, like you said, what is that pillar that you want players to take away from your experiences?
Hmm. I love it. Awesome. So come up for us an idea for either a game that you're currently working on or a game that you are playing, perhaps if you don't have one, or just come up with a new game idea. That's always fun. That somehow gives us a singular purpose, something the player can take away, learn from, and experience from. As always, we love seeing those posted. If you are feeling brave, do the homework and post it to LinkedIn, and then you can tag us, the Indie Game Academy, or you can tag Nicholas O'Brien, of course. We'll give you a thumbs up. We'll give you some feedback. We'll tell you it's great. All right, it is the end of the episode. Nicholas, is there anything you would like to plug or any last words of wisdom you'd like to give us before we say goodbye?
I guess no. The thing that I would plug is yeah, please go check out Bundle of Joy. It's been posted in the chat. I hope it's doing the things that I'm talking about here. And I think the other thing that I would say is as indie developers and indie designers, it's yeah, rough out there, right? It's not easy, but keep plugging away. Think about how this channel, this experience, is a way in which you're building your network that will last for hopefully a very long time.
Mm-hmm. Love that. Yeah. Every little step you take, every little way you get out there is a potential avenue in the future. Some of the people that I was working with in my very first job, even before my first job, are still core contributors, are still helping me find work. Every little step you take is a step. Try not to get too focused on the end destination and enjoy every little step. I love that as a final message. All right. I think then it is time for us to say goodbye. Thank you, everybody, for coming and listening to our wonderful show. Nicholas, thank you for coming here and giving us your wisdom.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Seriously, thank you so much for inviting me.
100%. Thank you to all question askers. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, we'll be here again every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time in the Discord. There are links to join down below. We'll see you all again next time. Adios, people.